is a springtime ring to have a friend right in your corner. Your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care. Each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond, and thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, I'm happy to talk about this interface between Christianity and medicine. And tonight, on the occasion of our 150th birthday for the state of West Virginia, I thought it was appropriate to bring this interface together in a way that I think will make sense to you. I want to talk a little bit about the life of Stonewall Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson, of course, had his boyhood home here in central West Virginia with the Stonewall Jackson 4-H camp now at the location. This is where his grandparents raised him. And so we have a natural tie of interest to Stonewall Jackson. But also, this is the 150th year that he was fatally wounded on May the 3rd, 1863, and it was said when General Robert E. Lee heard that there was friendly fire and that Stonewall had been wounded in his left arm, had to have an amputation, that it was that though Stonewall lost his left arm, Robert E. Lee said, "I've lost my right hand." And indeed, Stonewall Jackson is probably one of the most famous generals of all time. Certainly his name Stonewall, his nickname Stonewall, is the most famous nickname in all history. It's a rather amazing, isn't it, the things that have happened around the life of Stonewall. And yet we don't know so much about him, but I want to shed light on this because I have a book called Stonewall Jackson's Books of Maxims. This was just recently published, and this is by James I. Robertson, Jr. He's a leading authority on Stonewall Jackson, and he was preparing a Civil War book down at Tulane University in New Orleans when he discovered the handwritten maxims of Stonewall Jackson. These had been lost for about 150 years after Stonewall's death. They just disappeared. But Stonewall carried this his handwritten book of maxims around, and he would refer to them frequently, similar to how we would refer to the book of Proverbs. If we're trying to obtain the wisdom of God and understand the Holy Spirit's purpose for our life and lead a godly life, we would refer to God's Word and particularly to the Proverbs. So Stonewall had written down a number of things that are Christian, and as he was a Christian, and he referred to them frequently. And I want to share with you some of them tonight. I'm not going to read the whole book, and you perhaps want to go to the library and get out Stonewall Jackson's Book of Maxims. It's well worth looking at, but I hope you'll agree as I share a few of these things. Well, first of all, let's look at one that I think will resonate to us here in Buchanan, since we have the United Methodist Conference coming to town this week. And this happens every June for us, and so I think it's appropriate to begin to intersect where Stonewall Jackson referred to John Wesley. John Wesley, of course, was a leading theologian in the 1700s, and he also he wrote the leading medical text of that time, and so Stonewall Jackson was familiar with that. Also, of course, he grew up here in central West Virginia, and we had any number of circuit riding preachers of the Methodist denomination come through and establish churches throughout central West Virginia. In fact, if you look at how we have our churches, they're about as far apart as you can ride a horse in one day, and they're spread throughout our area. But anyway, John Wesley's great beatitude is cleanliness is next to godliness. This was well known as a Methodist maxim in the 1700s, 1800s, when Stonewall Jackson was being raised. And so he adopted that one and wrote in his own hand, "Cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanness in body, clothes, or habitation." And he was a very neat and very clean person. Anna Jackson, his wife, wrote of her husband's dress that he was always in good taste and faultlessly neat. Everything he wore was of the best material. And then a nephew of Stonewall Jackson's adds, "In the care of his person and dress he was unusually neat and tidy. I never knew anyone to be more particular in this respect than he was." So he followed John Wesley. Cleanliness is next to godliness. That's one of the maxims of Stonewall Jackson. And he used these little statements to refer to frequently to keep himself on the right track. He said of himself when he was at West Point, he wrote back to his sister here at Jackson's Mill in West Virginia, Virginia at that time, but he wrote back and said, even though all of the people who are becoming soldiers here at West Point are outstanding, well-organized people, he said, I am the most particular. And he could see that he himself was structuring his life in more detail than anyone else that he knew. So let me share with you a few of these maxims on good behavior. There's different sections to his book, and you may want to refer to other ones, of course. But since our program combines Christianity and medicine, let me begin by what his personal physician said. This is Dr. Hunter McGuire. Now, if you are a veteran or if you know anything about veterans hospitals, you'll recognize Hunter McGuire not only is the personal physician of Stonewall Jackson, but that is the name of one of our great VA hospitals at Richmond, Virginia, McGuire Medical Center, Hunter McGuire Medical Center. So the VA even honors this doctor. But he said, as he observed Stonewall, he said, under the grave and generally serious manner, sometimes almost stern, there's a strong human passion dominated by his iron will. Of course, his iron will is how he got the name Stonewall. And he had a strong sense of duty, probably instilled by his grandparents working the farm, working the mill here in Central West Virginia near Jane Lew, the Stonewall Jackson 4-H camp now. But anyway, he had this strong will, and there was earthly ambition. There was a great soldier, a deep love for all that is true, for the beautiful, for the poetry of life, for a wealth of rich and quick imagination that few would give him credit. Yes, beyond what ordinary men possess. It is remarkable if you think of Stonewall coming out of poverty, an orphan, getting a chance to study at West Point, but really, there are many people who studied at West Point that we don't know about 150 years later, but the whole world knows about Stonewall Jackson. So his doctor is crediting that with his strong will, with his ambition, with his quick imagination, and he said, yes, it was far beyond what ordinary men possess. And yet he told me, when sitting at the tent one dreary night, so just the doctor and the general together, that he would not exchange one moment of his life hereafter for all the earthly glory he could win. So he was a devout Christian and Presbyterian by persuasion. McGuire testified to Jackson's natural appetites for glory, corrected by grace, he said. And he believed in attaining advancement as whenever possible, but only if merited. And so he drew the line between fame and notoriety. And ambition was there, but also virtue. So there's much we can say about Stonewall Jackson. Well, what did he say? What are the rules? So let's go over a few more of these maxims or rules that he lived by. He said, through life, let your principal objective be the discharge of duty. If anything conflicts with it, adhere to the former and sacrifice the latter. And I understand the sense of duty. I've made reference on this program over the years to my father, who was an esteemed country doctor, made house calls, had a wonderful sense of duty for his patients and for the practice of medicine. And Stonewall Jackson had that same strong sense of duty. Nothing came ahead of duty. He would tolerate a private or another general or anyone else around him if they were obeying orders, if they were following the orders that were often coming, say, from Robert E. Lee, and then Stonewall carrying them out. And he would march his men hard and fast, and they would attack ferociously. And he demanded that type of sense of duty and practiced it himself. So this is his first maxim of his behavior. In one sense, there's a statement he said when there was one sense that he had never missed a duty day. He had never taken a sick day. We had two students, incidentally, graduating from Buckhannon Upshur High School this year, a male and a female student, who have never missed a day of school from kindergarten clear through. And Stonewall was that type of person too, a sense of duty, a sense of health, and he said when someone commented on that, he said, "It's very good." He said, "I hope that you will be able to say so after the war is over." So he was going to fight the war to victory. And many scholars who will study the Civil War feel that if Stonewall had not been killed by friendly fire and wounded, and then he got an infection, and the infection could not be treated, it was amputated, the infection spread, he died. But if that had not happened, the South would have won the war. He was that great of a general. A second maxim we want to point out is he reminded himself, and the wisdom of this: be sociable, speak to all who speak to you, and those whose acquaintance you do not wish to avoid. Hesitate not to notice them first. So he was awkward sometimes in a social setting, but as you can see, he was inclined to address everyone, meet them, speak to them, and he would listen. He was a great listener. You never knew, according to the book here, comments about his maxims, you never knew that whether he disagreed with you or not, because he was listening and he would not give away his position. And he even had a stone wall face sometimes. If he disagreed with you, you did not know that. Interesting enough, though, he did have passion. He was an emotional person, and if he were complimented either by his men because he was a great general or others, then he would actually blush, and he appeared meek and shy to many people. But obviously, he trained himself to speak first. It's a good way to approach people and ask them a question that they can answer about themselves, and then that opens up the conversation. A second maxim along this line, he said, when in company, do not endeavor to monopolize all the conversation unless such monopolization appears necessary, but be content with listening and gaining information, yet converse rather than suffer conversation to draw to a close unnecessarily. So he was conscious of the rhythm of speech, and of course as a general, he was then instructing people about tactics, and he was, as I mentioned, probably the greatest general that we've ever had, and certainly a tactical general. And but he would teach, but he knew the rhythm of conversation, when to listen, when to speak, and when to draw the conversation to a close in a polite and a way that everyone was satisfied with. He was conscious of the other person, and I think again, thinking as a Christian, he was aware that other person, whoever they are, was precious in God's sight, and he counted that as a gift. He said, disregard public opinion when it interferes with your duty. Now, we have a lot of politicians today, and not statesmen. I use the word politician because that seems like a lesser term. But in the past, we've had statesmen. We've had men who who would do whatever was right in the sense of duty, not what would gain them notoriety or fame or whatever may come their way if they would follow the crowd. He's willing to disregard public opinion if it interfered with duty. He was very loyal to people, and he wrote letters back to his family, and it's interesting that the maxims he wrote have been preserved, though we thought they were lost for about 150 years until they turned up in Tulane in an archive library. But after you formed, another of the maxims says, after you have formed an acquaintance with an individual, never allow it to draw to a close without a cause. Now, if you thought that you had betrayed him or betrayed your sense of duty, that he was done with you. There was even several generals under him that he actually had court-martialed, or they began to proceedings for court-martial because they didn't follow orders and they did not adhere to duty. So he was very, very strict. And of course, that's how he won battles, because his men would follow him up in a charge that would lead to death. And they would charge again and again and again under his orders because he had that strong sense of duty. Another of his maxims regarding behavior says, endeavor to be at peace with all men. I've experienced this dealing with warriors and soldiers over the past 43 years of my medical practice and my training as a doctor, and dealing particularly most of those years with veterans. I've dealt with true heroes, and most of them are very peace-loving people. In other words, war is the last thing they really want to be involved in, but if they have to fight a war, they're going to fight to win. And so they would, most people I've talked with who are soldiers would say, agree with this statement of Stonewall Jackson's, endeavor to be at peace with all men. Certainly that's the first instance. And I know in the Old Testament, in the Bible, if you go back and read about King David, who killed his 10,000s and Saul killed his thousands. I mean, he was a great warrior, according to the statements in the Bible. But he said you always have to take stock, of course, and you want to make peace wherever possible. And so they did that in a variety of ways. And it's interesting that Stonewall Jackson, I mean, he had a big decision, didn't he? He was from Virginia, and West Virginia was a part of Virginia. And one of the ways to look at the Civil War was not a slave or no slave issue, but it was states' rights. And he was a states' rights person. He believed that the federal Constitution allowed the states to remain strong, and he thought that the federal government was intruding on states' rights. This was one of the things that prompted him to stay with Virginia. And Robert E. Lee, on the same basis. So we have to look at that through the eyes of history, and we probably are. There'll be other talks in our community about our statehood, what happened to us in 150 years ago. But certainly, in this case, Stonewall was a states' rights person. Another of his maxims was never speak disrespectfully of anyone without a cause. And so again, if he disagreed with you, you probably did not know it. And he would certainly never speak disrespectfully. He was always calm. Again, his wife has said he was utterly free from censoriousness, envy, detraction, and all uncharitableness, and certainly kept his rule that if he could not say something good of a man, he would not speak of him at all. And my mother taught that, and so we've been taught this type of wisdom in the mountains for years. Mother grew up going to the state 4-H camp at Jackson's Mill. That was her home base. She grew up in Salem, West Virginia, but Harrison County at that time didn't have their own 4-H camp. They used Jackson's Mill, and interesting enough, just by being a camper there over the years, she came to understand this maxim that if you cannot say something good about someone, don't speak at all. And that was certainly the way Stonewall Jackson approached his relationships. and his behavior. Many of these, we're not going to be able to go over all of these tonight, but I just want to wet your whistle that Stonewall Jackson's Books of Maxims is, especially at this season, as we remember his death 150 years ago, and we remember the birth of West Virginia 150 years ago, it's worth going back and looking how people thought, and certainly how one of the most famous generals, if not the most famous general of our history, Stonewall Jackson, approached his own life. Another one was, endeavor to do well everything which you undertake through preference. So everything that you undertake, do well. I was studying a while back economics. We all want to read articles about that from time to time, and when I read this maxim, I was reminded of General Electric, GE. Whatever endeavor they get into, they choose to get into, they want to be number one or number two in that field. Now, in some cases, they've been involved in something where they could not be number one or number two, and they have backed out of that. They've sold off that company, and someone else has taken that over. But they always endeavored to be excellent. And I think that's a good way to live our life. Certainly, this is what Stonewall Jackson did. He said, he wrote to his sister, he said, "Be not discouraged by disappointments and difficulties, but on the contrary, let each stimulate you to greater exertions for attaining noble ends, and an approving conscience at least will be your reward." He also knew, of course, of Henry David Thoreau, and Henry David Thoreau, which we read Walden's Pond in high school, and Thoreau is quoted often, but he said, Stonewall Jackson remembered this statement: "I know of no one more encouraging, of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor." So if we recognize we have a strong will, we can do almost anything, and that's what Stonewall was all about. And it's interesting, isn't it? He said, to the glory of a soldier, always invincible in battle. Then he added, he was a man of God, first, last, and always. This was Jackson's creed to live by. And God would want us to be excellent, wouldn't he? I've always thought about that whatever we set our mind to, we should be the best we can be. I don't know if I got that from Stonewall, but certainly my parents taught that to me, and indirectly, I imagine, it's come down through the mountains from folks like Stonewall Jackson. Another one of these is, spare no effort to suppress selfishness, unless that effort would entail sorrow. So we want to not be selfish. We want to be giving and generous. Ovid, a philosopher we don't really study now, but back in those days, people learned Latin, and they learned Greek. The reasons the Presbyterians had so many colleges, like D&E, Davis and Elkins, is a Presbyterian college in our neighborhood. But the Presbyterians particularly wanted, even on the frontier, wanted to teach Greek and Latin, and teach it with the scholars like Ovid, who said, everyone was eloquent in behalf of his own cause. He that liveth not somewhat to others liveth little to himself. So the remarks are there that we need to consider another person. Of course, Benjamin Franklin was well known to Stonewall Jackson, and I remember in the 11th grade reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and it changed my life. And that's another book worth going back to. But he said in his Poor Richard's Almanac, which Stonewall Jackson had read, he that falls in love with himself will have no rivals. And so Jackson determined never to be selfish, and to have faith in God, and put God first, and therefore put his neighbor first. Okay. Another one of these would be sacrifice your life rather than your word. And he was fighting. He was fighting with his men when he was wounded. And again, if he had not died, his perseverance probably would have led to the victories that would have changed the tide of war. And that would, of course, changed our history. We don't know how that would have turned out. But Stonewall, even in his writing, as he writes out his maxims, he is saying that he will go with Virginia, he will go with states' rights, but God will give the victory to the one that God wants to give the victory to. In other words, he recognized that the North may win, the South may win, but it was God who would decide the victory. And so sacrifice your life rather than your word was another of his maxims. He said, breaking of your word is a folly, a dishonesty, a crime. It is a folly because nobody will trust you afterwards. It is both a dishonor and a crime, truth being the first duty of religion and morality, and whoever has not truth cannot be supposed to have any good quality and must become the devastation of God and man. And that is an important thing to remember in this time, isn't it? I was saying this at graduation the other day. We recognized that there were 6 Eagle Scouts. Scott Lampinen, our superintendent, pointed that out in his comments from the stage when we had the Buchanan Upshur High School graduation on Friday night at West Virginia Wesleyan College. There were 6 Eagle Scouts. And I was remembering as an Eagle Scout, going back almost 50 years now, that every time in my life I wanted to make sure that people knew that I was telling the truth. I would say Scout's honor, and I would know that, and I would value that. So that's exactly, though they didn't have Boy Scouts, of course, 150 years ago when Stonewall grew up at Jackson's Mill here in Central West Virginia, at that time Virginia, but he did know the idea that we have to be honest and we have to tell the truth. So there's many other things here. Let me close with one about temperance. My mother was a great person for temperance, no alcohol, no tobacco. Stonewall was the same. And he also was very particular about what he ate. He was very conscious of eating healthy foods and healthy diets. And so he remained insistent to the end for good health, that people should eat even what they don't like if it's healthy for them. Interesting man, a peculiar man, a particular man, a man of maxims. And I hope that as we approach the 150th birthday of West Virginia this June, and as we remember the fighting spirit of Stonewall Jackson, who died May 1863, 150 years ago, that we can not forget history, but go back, look at what made these people tick, including Stonewall Jackson, who is particularly noteworthy for us here in Central West Virginia. Well, until the next time, this is Dr. Greenbrier Allman thanking you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Particular thanks for Channel 3 for the opportunity to come your way each week for some 35 years. What a blessing that has been. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in Central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care, Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buchanan for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.